Welcome to Talking Justice 2016, presented by Bendigo's Loddon Campaspe Community Legal Centre, a program of ARC Justice. I'm Nicole Smith and I am the Program Director for Talking Justice 2016. I'm also a lawyer at the Loddon Campaspe Community Legal Centre. We begin by acknowledging that we gather on the land of the Dja Dja Wurrung, whose ancestors and their descendants are the traditional owners of this country. We acknowledge their living culture, unique role in the life of this region, and that they continue to perform age-old ceremonies of celebration, initiation and renewal. We also acknowledge their elders past and present and welcome members of their community who are with us today. Now in its third year, Talking Justice provides an opportunity for people of regional Victoria to reflect on the big justice issues: refugee policy, crime and punishment, gender equality and sexual diversity, dispossession, reconciliation and global poverty. Harvard professor and moral philosopher Michael Sandel, in his book Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do, says that to achieve a just society, we have to reason together about the meaning of the good life and to create a public culture hospitable to the disagreements that will inevitably arise. Here, right now, we are seeking to build a hospitable public culture. And so we invite you to engage with this morning's presenters in that spirit, mindful of the views that you have and committed to our collective well-being. Please honour the opportunity to listen to the speakers, honour our invitation to them and their willingness to come, and honour the limited time that we have together this morning. We would like to thank our speakers, particularly our facilitator, Martin Kriegier, who will guide our discussions. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Martin Kriegier. Martin is the Gordon Samuels Professor of Law and Social Theory, co-director of the Network of Interdisciplinary Studies of Law at the University of New South Wales. He is a deep thinker, wonderful conversationalist, and we are lucky to be in his hands. Please join me in welcoming Martin.
Thank you very much, Nicole. That was all true. I'd like to ask all our panellists to join us. We have a distinguished panel of lawyers. I'm sorry about that, but that's the subject. But not only lawyers. No. And last night, for those who were here, even if you weren't here, it's true, the subject was justice in an era of global dislocation. And there's a lot of that about. Here we're focusing more on the legal process, and our subject is, our general subject, which will take us in various directions, is accountability, engagement and activism, getting smarter on crime and punishment. Sorry, I said that wrong. Getting smart, how do we do this? Getting smarter on crime, that's it. There's a question mark at the end of it, and I wasn't sure how to say that, but I presume a question is intended. Are we getting smarter on these things? The order of speakers will be as you see from my immediate right onwards. I'll introduce each person separately so you have fresh in your mind who is speaking to you. And first we have the Victorian Ombudsman, Ombudsperson, Ombudsman, that's a bold statement. Deborah Glass. Deborah studied law at Monash University, and after a brief period of practice, she joined a US investment bank in Switzerland in 1985. In 1989, she was appointed to the Hong Kong Securities and Futures Commission and became Senior Director. In 1998, she became the Chief Executive of the Investment Management Regulatory Organisation in London. 2001, she joined the UK Police Complaints Authority. 2004, became a Commissioner with the new Independent Police Complaints Commission of England and Wales. 2012, she was made an Officer of the British Order of the British Empire, OBE. She holds, I'm told in my briefing notes, that Deborah holds a firm belief in public sector integrity and the protection of human rights, but it's not clear whether that belief is in these as matters of fact or these as matters of aspiration. In any event, I'm very delighted that she's here to speak, and maybe she'll elucidate that for us in the next little while. Thank you. Deborah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Accountability, engagement, activism, that's what we're here to talk about today, and I'm guessing that I am the accountability element in that particular triad. Talking justice. Now, as you probably aware, the Ombudsman, and it is in fact Ombudsman, it's a Swedish word, it's intended to be gender neutral, and I often get asked if I'm an ombudswoman, and I say that I am not, because it is in fact a term that applies to all people who occupy this role. It actually means defender of the people, which is rather a nice thing to be. And if I could spend a minute on the origin of ombudsman, why there is an ombudsman, it is actually because fundamentally of the imbalance of power between the individual and the state, which is a inherently unfair relationship. And as the Victorian Ombudsman, I actually deal with complaints about over 1,000 public sector bodies, all 79 local councils, which, as you're probably aware, is a fairly rich source of popular discontent. But there is actually one agency that generates more complaints even than councils, even than parking fines and rubbish collection. So actually today, I'm not going to be talking justice. I'm going to be talking prisons. We dealt with about 3,000 complaints last year about our prison system. And that isn't only because there is a free call line to the Ombudsman's office in every single Victorian prison. Are you aware of that? That's only been in place since 2006, that free call line. And my office has actually been around since 1973. And the Ombudsman has been quite active in the prisons environment, actually, since starting in 73. And here, let me introduce you to the first Ombudsman, Sir John Dillon. In his very first annual report, Sir John commented on the number of complaints he was getting from prisoners. He was getting about a third of his 1,334 complaints actually came from prisoners. That was 391 complaints he got. I get about 10 times that. And if you think actually that things in prisons are grim today, you actually should read some of his reports, because he was describing in these reports the experience of prisoners in Pentridge's infamous H Division. Anybody remember H Division? They were required to smash rocks. They didn't have beds in some cases, and he also commented rather presciently that they had been deprived of the right to smoke. Now, times have changed. Pentridge, as you know, not unlike we're coming in here this morning, actually seeing this old jail, turned into this magnificent sort of theatre complex. Pentridge is becoming a luxury housing development in Melbourne. And let's not talk about the smoking ban. But if complaints are an indicator of pressure points in the system, perhaps times haven't quite changed enough. And I'm just putting up here some of the reports that the last Ombudsman, the one before me, put up around the prison system. He did quite a few investigations into prisons issues, and the most recent one before I took in the role was all about overcrowding in our prison system. And that was the situation when I came into the role in 2014. So when I came in, I became aware very quickly that prisons were the #1 source of complaints to my office. And a fairly typical complaint that we were getting were from prisoners who were unable to access programs that they needed to do to get parole. No programs, no parole, so people were staying in prison longer. They weren't able to get onto these programs, and some of them were actually being released really at the end of their sentence without having done the programs at all. So, which meant in the case of some of these violence intervention programs that, without the causes of their offending behaviour actually being addressed. So that got me thinking, that and the continued volume of prisoner complaints, which was not drying up, are our prisons actually making us safer? Are we getting smarter on crime and punishment? So in an attempt to answer these questions, I did an investigation last year into rehabilitation and reintegration of prisoners. And I want to just tell you a little bit about what I found. So, we are locking up more people than ever before. We are finding that those people we're locking up are returning to prison at a higher rate than ever before. And thirdly, it's costing us more than ever before. Last year, over $1 billion. Now that kind of says to me that something doesn't add up. These numbers also made clear something that I've no doubt many people in this room have been aware of for a very long time, that my investigation had to look wider than the walls of our prisons for the answers. So in this very brief presentation, I'm only going to be touching on a fraction of this report. You're very welcome to take a look at it online. It actually sold out very quickly, that prisons report. I was told it was a bestseller in prisons. But what I will do is just look at some of the factors that sat behind that. And again, I think they won't be a surprise to many of you, and certainly not to anybody in this room who's been working in the criminal justice system, because what you will see is that changes to our parole system. We're keeping more people in prisons. We had an almost doubling of the number of parole orders denied in 2014, and that number is going up again in 2015. Sentencing reforms, baseline sentencing, abolition of suspended sentences, more recently somewhat mitigated by community correction orders. Bail reforms, again another factor you can see here. Seeing more people being remanded into custody, and our report quotes 25% of the prison population actually being on remand, which is nearly double the figure of 4 years before. So what are we doing about that? So, more people in prisons, higher population, higher recidivism. What has been the response of the system to that? Well, here it is. A massive building program to build more prisons. Ease the overcrowding. But prison is actually the most expensive response we have to criminal behaviour. And we can see from the recidivism rate in that last slide, it doesn't appear to be working. So let's just take a look at what's going on in our prisons and who have we got actually locked up. Well, the links between imprisonment and disadvantage are pretty well known, and I don't claim as the Ombudsman to have come up with some great original revelation on this subject. But the facts are still very impactful when you look at them in detail. Alcohol and drug abuse, mental health, high rates of unemployment, often a complete lack of engagement with either schooling or work. These are the marks of our prisoners. Just, take an example, looking at the high school completion rate. That's, in prisons, 6% of men, compared with nearly 90% of the population as a whole. I mean, that's actually a very, very stark and very striking comparison. As the excellent work of Jesuit Social Services tells us, postcode data is also incredibly compelling, the link between disadvantage and imprisonment. Prison, a family affair, sadly as well. The children of prisoners are 6 times more likely to be imprisoned than their peers. And the particular problems of women prisoners, I think also very, very striking and really very sad. Highly likely to be victims of abuse themselves. So one of the things I asked in the report is, how do you address the problem of recidivism when prison is the place that some people actually feel safest? So that's a bit of a grim picture about the people inside our prisons, and what's actually being done inside prisons to address this? Well, actually quite a lot is going on. There are programs available, lots of different types to address offending behaviour. We have drug and alcohol treatment programs, there are educational programs. But what we found in this report, that in all cases, the sheer number of prisoners meant that the system is simply struggling to cope with the weight of that increasing demand. More people in prison, more demand for programs, greater demand as a result of the changes to the parole system. And that's what we were seeing. So the combination of tightening parole has meant huge delays in actually getting access to the kind of programs that are available inside. And the impact of that is also rather worrying. Some people actually aren't bothering. Now, this quote, which included in our report, I thought was pretty compelling stuff. This comes from a prison officer. And I'll let you read that for yourselves. But as the prisoners themselves, some of them put it rather colloquially, you can stuff your programs and stuff your parole. It's not worth it, what people were saying. So the impact of that, and I think this should worry us as a community concerned about public safety, is that increasingly prisoners are coming out of prison straight from maximum security facilities at the end of their sentence. So they're not bothering with parole, which means that, come the end of the sentence, the prison, they have to be released. That's the point. And they haven't done the programs that we as a community have said they need to do. And that surely is not making us safer. So let's just take a look briefly at what happens when people leave the prison gates. And again, another quote that I thought I'd share with you from a community service organisation, which I think says it all. They are the bottom of the priority list. And bear in mind that alcohol and drugs issues are actually a key driver of recidivism. Access to drug treatment inside prisons and upon release, very limited. Mental health, also a factor. So, this was for me, quite a powerful quote about why people actually, when they get out of prison, think that it's not a bad idea to go straight back there. The impact of drugs and alcohol employment. When you're out of prison, actually, you're no longer the responsibility of the justice health system. You actually fall back onto the broader public health system. You go into waiting lists, nothing happens. So there's a complete disconnect between the two. Employment, a really obvious factor. Most prisoners were unemployed before they went into prison, and their chances are generally not improved by incarceration. And the final quote I just wanted to share with you comes from a female prisoner, and this was a really powerful for me and very, very sad quote about the experience of a young woman who was released from prison, basically onto the street. And she had nowhere to go when the gates open. It was June. They put you in the clothes you came in with. She'd put on weight, so nothing fitted. Got nothing. There's no one here to support me. I had no other option but to tough it out. And that, sadly, is a very, very typical experience of female prisoners upon release. And again, many of them, as I mentioned earlier, victims of abuse themselves. They haven't got a home to go back to. Okay, so what is the solution to all of this? There is actually a bit of good news among all that gloom. We actually have quite a lot of good practice in Victoria already, as well as international experience to learn from. We just need to do more of it. So we've got a drug court in Dandenong, which has substantially reduced the rate and seriousness of reoffending. I was really pleased to see in the budget this year that they're adding another $32 million to expand the drug court's operations into the Melbourne Magistrates Court. Koori courts, again, culturally appropriate models. No evaluation since 2006, but we know they work. Neighbourhood Justice Centre, again, why is there only one? And a fantastic place in the prison system, the Transition Centre for Judy Lazarus, has very low rates of recidivism, that has 25 beds, so one place. 25 people can get access to that compared with the thousands that are released every year. Justice reinvestment, again, across the ditch. We know New Zealand actually has quite a bit of success with this. We know that, indeed, that great law and order bastion of Texas has decided that rather than building more prisons, that there is money to be saved, actually, in diverting people out of the prison system. It's a remarkable revelation. So let me just end on this note that you don't actually have to reinvent the wheel. But what we do need to solve this problem is a whole-of-government approach. Because tackling the myriad interwoven issues that have created a prison system that is simply not working, that is costing us an ever-increasing sum, that is sending people back into the community to reoffend, isn't just a prisons issue. It isn't even just a justice issue. It's a public health issue. It's a housing issue. It's an education issue. It's an unemployment issue. It's a social issue. It's a problem that affects all of us, and we as a community have to actually address it. So the reform in the law, for example, to allow Aboriginal prisoners to retain the proceeds of artworks that they have made in prisons, is a very small example that they've got some money to get on with to allow them to support their rehabilitation. And if that reform keeps one prisoner from returning to prison, that's $295,000 saved on an average sentence. And that's $295,000 that could be spent, for example, on increasing drug rehabilitation in rural Victoria to stop people entering the system in the first place. It could be spent on helping those inside find a roof over their heads and worthwhile occupation when they get out. It is actually possible to make the leap from talking prisons into talking justice. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, we need to do it. Let's do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deborah. It occurred to me while I was listening that this building is a kind of metaphor for the kind of progress that Deborah was suggesting. It's not every prison which becomes a theatre, but perhaps that's a good way for it to go. I was also interested, the office of Ombudsman around the world is not the best known of public offices. I do a lot of work in post-communist Poland, and one of the interesting developments in Poland, when the regime was in an impasse, the communist regime was in an impasse with Solidarity in the 80s, they thought they didn't have any performance legitimacy because the country was bankrupt. They had no ideological legitimacy because no one believed it. So they thought, well, maybe they can get legal legitimacy. And they started creating institutions, a constitutional court which did no business, administrative courts which did nothing. And they got this tireless consumer advocate, who I later came to know, a woman called Eva Łętowska, and they made her ombudsman. It was just across from Scandinavia, as you mentioned, and they thought, this has to be harmless, this post. And she, because it was the first time that people in Poland discovered an officer of the state, a public official, who went against other public, who investigated, who did the sort of things that we've listened to now, she had an enormous public and enormous political impact. And I'm very, very glad that we've had her local representative or counterpart to speak to us today. Now, when I was reading about Justice Judy Small's remarkable career, I kept being put in mind of those yarns, you know, a million of them, which begin. Once upon a time there was an Englishman, an Irishman and a Frenchman or whatever. So once upon a time there was a psychologist, a folk singer and a judge, and here she is. Well, I should say a little more. A little more. The law is Judy's third profession. She began in psychology. She then went and spent 16 years in a very, very successful, and I'm sure known to many of you, career as a folk singer. She won various awards. Her songs, written songs, have been covered by many very well-known singers, and she, as a performer, got the Mo Award for Australian Folk Performer of the Year. Then she moved to, and has, to my great regret, relinquished public singing performances and became a judge of the family court, and it's in that role that she'll speak to us. I felt a kind of subliminal parallel with everything that I heard. I began in, politics or philosophy. I had the ardent ambition to be a folk singer, and I sang a lot. My success was not worldwide, but still, it was a career. I didn't go into the family court, but I did get divorced. So in many ways, and I ended up in the law. So in many ways we're really counterparts, but I'm less distinguished, and therefore I'll get off the stage and Justice Judy Small will get on the stage.
Thank you very much, Martin. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we meet on Aboriginal land and to pay my respects to the elders of the local people and to any other elders of Aboriginal tribes who might be here. I also want to say thank you for the invitation to speak today. When I saw the topic, I thought, but wait a minute, I'm not a criminal lawyer. I don't know anything about crime and punishment. What are they asking me to speak for? So I'm speaking on whatever I like today. And I speak very much in a personal capacity. I do not speak for the court. And the court, while I am a family law judge, I'm actually a judge of the Federal Circuit Court, not the Family Court of Australia. And I say that simply because I think the judges of the Family Court of Australia would complain if I didn't. So it's strange for me to be here speaking at a forum on justice in my current capacity, or having been invited in my current capacity as a judge, because of course I've always spoken and sung about this stuff for many, many years. And I've always been free to say whatever I like and to express my opinion about things like justice and peace and all sorts of stuff like that. Judges don't have political opinions that they express in public. And I have felt the limitation of that and that lack of freedom quite keenly in the only 3 years now since I've been a judge. But there is light at the end of that tunnel for me, because judges have to retire at 70. We call that the age of statutory senility. And I will not be a judge forever. So one day I may again be able to speak and sing exactly what I want to say. Nevertheless, I will be saying some things today about these issues. The other thing to say is that I'm not a criminal lawyer, so what do I know about crime and punishment? Very little. They say that criminal lawyers see bad people at their best, while family lawyers see good people at their worst. And I think there's some very great truth in that, and I'll be talking a little bit more about issues in family law and justice, very briefly, of course. But what I really want to talk about today, and of course I do have opinions about issues like sentencing and prisons and all sorts of things as a private citizen. But what I want to talk to you today is about advocacy. I was told that that's one of the topics that we were that this forum was about. So I want to talk about advocacy and the values that underpin our advocacy. And anyone who is offended by the F word should leave now. Because I, for my whole life, in the past and will be forever, a proud feminist. Now, every time I say that, I always feel like I have to say, and this is what I mean by that. Being a feminist for me means that I am willing to work with any person of any gender, colour, nationality, creed, political persuasion, level of ability or economic status, who is willing to work with me to make this world a better place for women, on the clear and certain understanding that if it is a better place for women, it will be a better place for everybody. That's what it means to me. If women feel safer walking the streets, everyone will feel safer walking the streets. If women are safer at home, everyone will feel safer at home, and so on. So that's the basis on which I build my views and my values. I'm very interested, when I'm talking about advocacy, in the concept of power, because I was really interested to hear what Deborah was saying about the state and the individual and the imbalance of power between those two, and that's why we need ombudsmans. I think we call them ombudsmans.
Ombudsmen.
Yes. Or officers of the ombudsman. Because of that imbalance. Power is something that permeates, of course, everything we do. And what fascinates me is who has it, what do they do with it, and for whose benefit? And those questions have permeated my whole professional life. Psychology is certainly about that. It's about empowering people, helping people to understand the imbalances of power in their lives so that they can be empowered to live happier lives, I suppose. Certainly my music was about that. I don't expect any of you to have heard any of my music. One thing I learned very quickly when I was travelling the world as a folk singer is that you're only famous if people know who you are. Think about that. So I don't expect you to know, but a lot of my music was about power. It was about people coming up against institutions and other people who had more power than they did, and how we as a community can deal with that issue. And certainly the law is about power. Family law, as much as criminal law, is about power on a different plane, on a much more, in some ways confined, but in other ways general plane. I'll come back to that in a moment. One thing I learned from my father is that words have power. When I learnt that from my dad, who was a journalist, and by pure coincidence, given that we're talking about advocacy today, he was, in my childhood, the editor of the local newspaper, which was called the Coffs Harbour Advocate. So I learned about words and their power at a very early age. When I was at school, one of my school reports said, "Judy excels in all aspects of oral work." My father later told me that he thought that meant I talked too much. And one of my teachers told my parents when I was about 11 that I would win a debate with Bob Menzies, for those of you who remember who he was. Language is an enormously powerful tool when we're talking about advocacy, and we should never throw words about without thinking about what they mean, not only to us, but what they might mean to our audience and to the people we're advocating for. The other thing I learned from my parents in a small country town was that a commitment to community service and the principles of social justice, that is, looking out for others, or, as some might put it, loving your neighbour as yourself, forms the basis for a fulfilling and meaningful life. My mother, when I was 12, I was given an autograph book for Christmas. You're not old enough to know what autograph books are you? Never mind. And it was populated already with some quotes that, with some writings. My father, in his inimitable fashion, wrote in my autograph book, "In God we trust. All others please pay cash." And my mother wrote a quote from C.J. Dennis's The Sentimental Bloke, and it said this: "Life's what you make it, and he who tries to grab the shining stars from out the skies grows crook on life and calls the world a cheat and tramples on the daisies at his feet." And that has stayed with me, as you can see. I didn't have to read that. That has stayed with me for more than 50 years. That when we're talking about advocacy, we're talking about noticing the daisies and making sure that they bloom, and making sure that when we are daisies, we don't let people trample on us. I must say that in the many years that I have seen myself as an advocate, and advocate comes from, the word advocate means speaking for. It's what the Latin root comes from. When we speak for others, when we talk for others, when we give others a voice, is what it really means. I've actually seen changes. Advocacy could work. When I started my work as a counsellor, it was legal for a man to rape his wife. It was illegal to be homosexual. When I was very young, women had to leave the public service when they married. When my mother was a nurse, she had to leave nursing when she had her first child. We have seen an enormous change in the last 50 years in our culture and in our society. Advocacy works sometimes. It doesn't work all the time, and it doesn't work every time. But it does work enough times to keep us going. And it needs to work enough times to keep us going, because when it doesn't work, it's heartbreaking. When we throw our lives into a cause and into the work and the energy that we put in, that is enormous, and then when nothing comes of it, or very little comes of it, it really does break our hearts. And I think Julian might talk a bit about that in a moment. But it doesn't mean we should stop, because advocacy and speaking for others and the cause, whatever it is always worth it. When I was appointed as a judge, I took an oath of office. And after the oath had said things like, yes, I'll well and truly serve the people of Australia, whatever, it then said, and I will do right to all manner of people according to law, without fear or favour, affection or ill will. I take that very seriously. And in family law, of course, when we're talking about advocacy and justice, we're not talking about institutions and the individual, we're talking about individuals and the individual. But of course, that doesn't mean that there is no power imbalance. Deborah said that the issues in prisons were things like drugs and alcohol and mental illness. They also, those issues, permeate the family law system. And the other issue, which particularly permeates the family law system, is family violence. When I was working as a counsellor at the Rape Crisis Centre in Sydney in the 1970s, family violence was known as a domestic. And the police referred to it as, oh, it's just another domestic. Things have changed enormously since then. And while there's still a long way to go, we shouldn't forget that it was once legal to rape one's wife, and therefore legal, in a sense, to beat one's wife as well. It was seen. I remember a judge of the family court, Sally Brown, who used to be the chief magistrate of this state, and she used to talk about a case in the 80s when she was a magistrate, where the defence counsel, in a case of a man charged with assaulting his wife, said, oh, well, of course, Your Honour, it happened in the home. It was a domestic assault. And as though that were a exculpatory factor. And what Her Honour said to him was, thank you, Mr So-and-so, for pointing out that aggravating factor in this case. Nowadays, it is seen as an aggravating factor. But advocacy in my court, for me, is different, of course, than the people on the other side of the bar table. For them, it's advocating for their client. For me, advocacy is making sure, not so much speaking for people, but making sure that those who have a quieter or even silent voice in family law proceedings get heard. Those people particularly being self-represented litigants, and can I say I distinguish unrepresented litigants from self-represented litigants in family law, because unrepresented litigants are those people who could have a lawyer, who can afford it, or who would be eligible for legal aid, but who choose to represent themselves. They're the ones I call unrepresented litigants. Self-represented litigants are those who simply can't afford a lawyer and don't qualify for legal aid, and who must represent themselves. Those people have a very quiet voice in the family law system, and I see my role in the family law system is to make sure that they get heard. I always say to them, it must feel a bit like you're in a movie where everybody knows the script but you. And they nod. It's exactly what it's like. So my job is to help them with the script, to teach them when to come in and when to leave, to teach them or guide them as to when they say their lines and how they say them. Not what they say, but the process of how that goes. The other people who need advocacy in the court are people with a disability, a serious disability, whether physical, psychiatric, or as a result of emotional trauma from family violence. Those people need advocacy too. It is heartbreaking for me to see a woman who is the victim of family violence, or better said, a survivor of family violence, to see that woman being cross-examined by the perpetrator because we have no way at that moment of stopping that happening. We can put her in a separate place and have her give her evidence by video, but that's about the best we can do. There is a move, of course, to change that so that women in that position will get representation. So all of those people need protection and advocacy. But the ones who need it most in the family law system, of course, are children. Children about whom much of family law is. And they need protection, and they need to have their voices heard. And I am proud to say that in the family law system, their voices do get heard, either through an independent children's lawyer or through a family consultant who meets with the family and gives the court the views of the children. Martin and Julian both asked me if I was going to sing today, and I said no, because I don't anymore. But I think music is one of the, well, let's put it this way. There has never been a political cause or an activist cause which hasn't had music that goes with it. Never. Think about that. There is music in everything that we do as advocates, and I would urge you both to speak and to sing out for justice.
Well done, Judy.
Thank you very, very much. As I was listening to Judy talk, two themes, large themes, large in the work that I do, resonated with me. One is power and the other is advocacy, and they're deeply related, of course. I write a lot in an area called legal philosophy, and within that about the rule of law. And the rule of law is one of those cliche phrases these days. Everybody knows it, nobody knows what it means, but they know it's a good thing. And now, unprecedentedly in the last 30 years, billions of dollars worldwide are spent on rule of law promotion, rule of law reform. If you look in works of legal philosophy about the rule of law, there has become a kind of consensus that if you really want to know what the rule of law is about, it's about, let's not get too ambitious, it's about the formal qualities of rules. What's that mean? Well, basically, you don't have the rule of law if you, the citizen, don't know what's going to happen to you in the exercise of power. So what does that mean about the rules? Well, it means the rules have to be public, because you can't know a secret law. They have to only act forward, prospectively, not retrospectively, because if the act makes you liable for something that occurred before the act existed, you couldn't know that. The acts have to be, or the rules have to be relatively clear so that you can work out what's going on and what you're going to be allowed to do and what you're not going to be allowed to do. There's a list of this, and it became a kind of Anglophone philosophy consensus over the last 40 years. Recently, very, very clever legal philosopher, Jeremy Waldron, a New Zealander now in New York, said, look, that's not enough. And our legal systems know it's not enough, because apart from the formal quality of the rules, there's a hell of a lot that goes on in a good legal system, which is what he calls procedural, which has to do with precisely what Judy was saying. What happens to a person when they are disputing either a charge or against another person? They have to know the evidence against them. They have to be able to bring evidence in their own behalf. They have to be able to have representation. They have to be listened to by somebody who has some legal training. One could go on with this. The general point is this. Why does that matter? You can think, oh, well, that's what legal systems do. Why does it matter? He says, because if you don't have the possibility of advocacy, the possibility of presenting one's own case, listening to a case against you, then you aren't treated with the dignity of a person. You are treated like, or you could be treated like, a rabid dog or a dilapidated house, an object rather than a subject. I keep getting that wrong. I keep talking about a rabid house and a dilapidated dog, but you got the message that there is a difference between treating people as people with their own point of view, however eccentric, with their own view of what happened, with their own view about whether it was right, and unless you listen to that, even if ultimately you find against them, then you aren't treating them as persons. And now, if I can use this as a segue, I never know where that word came from. Once it didn't exist, and then the next day everybody segues. So I'm going to segue, because Julian McMahon is an impassioned advocate in the most desperate of circumstances, as many of you, I'm sure all of you, would know. He's a barrister, a Melbourne barrister. He's become not most important, but most, perhaps best known in Australia for his advocacy of the Andrew Chan and Murren Sukumaran in the recent, or up to the recent, their recent execution. He's been involved in, as he puts it, looking after people who no one else really wants to defend. He's a remarkable advocate, and I've once heard him speak about this extraordinary experience, an extraordinary act of devotion of going to Indonesia and trying to save the lives of these people. And you can hear this is not just a sort of technical legal business, having an advocate. It's a matter, in this case, of life and death, and it's always a matter of importance, and I'm very glad that Julian is here to tell us something about it.
Hello. My head's spinning because I thought I had a few good things to say, and that listening to the last few speakers, I just want to keep listening to them and talk about what they're talking about. For instance, I was thinking when Judy was speaking, now I do, my main area of work is probably murder and terrorism these days, and in murder cases now in sentencing, the idea that a murder that is in the house is in any way less serious than any other terrible murder has just completely disappeared. You know, the law has changed so much, probably in 15 years, really. And I was thinking also when we're hearing about prisoners leaving prison, I mean, what a disgrace it is to our community that you can walk out of prison as a young woman and have nothing and nobody. When we look at where all the money goes, I know of one case where a prisoner walked out, he'd been on medication, serious medication, he walked out without the medication. Nowhere to go, no money, no medication, no one interested, and he's literally dumped out the front. And of course it wasn't long before he's back in prison. About 2 weeks ago, I think it's 2 weekends ago, I was, because of bad timing, I'm not very good at my calendar, I was in Indonesia for the weekend. I had a trial going, so I had to fly out and fly back. And looking at you reminds me so much of that, because the lights were in my face and I couldn't see the people I was talking to. And it was an ASEAN literary conference. And my job there was to talk about arts and the law in a way. And it was a very moving experience for me in a way, because there was so much courage from all the young writers and poets and other people in the arts. I'm not sure whether there were singers there, but it's really exactly the same point. And my lecture there was really about the role of the writer or the poet or the dramatist in challenging unjust societies. But I was talking to a room full of people who really live that and who face, many of them face persecution and pressure for speaking up about things, exactly the kind of things we've been talking about today, the rule of law and fighting injustice or corruption and so on. So with that wild introduction, I'm going to talk briefly about the death penalty, but also just want to throw up some ideas because I think we're going to have perhaps almost an hour for questions. So I'll throw up some ideas about things that I think are important for communities and justice. But I'll talk briefly about the death penalty, which no one really wants to hear about on a Saturday morning. But for the last couple of weeks especially, but over months really, a number of people in different countries have been trying to help a guy in Singapore called Ko Jia Bing. I haven't looked at today's paper, so I don't know if it's in the paper, but he was a young man caught up in a violent robbery of a bloke on the street, and the facts were pretty unclear, but the victim died, and so it was a murder case in Singapore. And yesterday afternoon he was executed in Singapore. And the lead up to it, there have been many court cases about him. The case there's a sense of a screaming injustice in that case. And there are 6 judges in different courts who have studied the facts of the case, and 3 of them said he should not die because of the uncertainty of the various facts and tests not being met and so on, legal tests. And 3 said that he should die. And then apart from those 6 judges, there were numerous appeals and so on. Today's Saturday, so Thursday there was an urgent appeal in the afternoon, Thursday afternoon, and then that failed. And then there was another appeal late on Thursday night, and they said, okay, well, if you file by 11, we'll hear your appeal. They filed by 11 p.m, and the appeal was heard at 9 a.m. The barrister running the case said, look, these are really difficult, complex constitutional issues and administrative law issues and so on. This really just shouldn't be going ahead at this speed. And they said, well, it's on now, carry on. Unsurprisingly, because I've already told you the outcome, he lost the case, and the young fellow was executed a few hours later. And the reason I'm telling you that story is for lawyers, it's confronting to see, there's usually, not always, but usually where there's speed with punishment, something's going wrong, whether it's in our legal system or any system. Usually speed and thoughtful, just outcomes don't travel well together. And nor does secrecy and law. But I'm going to leave the death penalty shortly, but just to put it in context for you, because slightly depressing concept for me, but I'll probably be significantly engaged in death penalty work for some time. Recently was just become the president of a small NGO called Reprieve, which deals with death penalty work. And just looking around our region, in the last few weeks, now most of you won't know this because it's not newsworthy. And even in the countries that I'm talking about, it's not newsworthy. But in the last few weeks, Japan executed 2 people, Malaysia executed a few people, Taiwan executed, Singapore executed, Indonesia. We don't even know how many people Singapore executed yesterday, whether it was 1 or 2. I can pretty much guarantee even an audience of people so concerned about things that they would get up on a Saturday morning to come and listen to speakers probably don't know that 3 people were executed in Malaysia a few weeks ago. And Indonesia, which has been in the press a bit more, is planning to execute 14 people. Now, that's one I've been following very closely. So you can imagine if you're a prisoner on death row in Indonesia, you'd be following it pretty closely too. Who are the 14 people who are going to be executed? Not named. Speculation. A whole bunch of people on death row are on Nusa Kambangan Island, which is where people do get executed, but there's plenty of reliable guesses, but their names aren't identified. When are they going to get executed? Not known. Government's response, well, we're going to execute pretty soon, maybe when it stops raining, or maybe before Ramadan, or maybe after, or We'll see if there are any other legal appeals that any of them want to take, and we'll get around to it pretty soon. That's literally the state of play. So you don't know whether you're going to die, and you don't know when. You don't know whether you're on the list. The list is not public. And so that's the state of play in Indonesia today. And in the last few weeks, there's been enormous scramble with some people trying to get through the court system. Now, I'm not making this accusation, but other people do, that some of those cases involve very bad things with regard to the rule of law, profound injustices, and I don't know enough about the detail to confidently say what they are. I mean, you can guess, and I know roughly what they are, but they're not my cases to be able to be precise. But there's a lot of worry and drama about some of those cases. So the reality is, we're sitting here in Melbourne, or Bendigo, and all around us, people are, we're in the countries around us, and our countries that are our friends, people are getting executed. And if the new president of the Philippines is to be believed, he plans to execute 100,000 people in the next 6 months. Which is what he said, and I think he's planning for most of them to be public. He wants public executions. And if you go a little bit further afield, countries like Pakistan execute 4 people a week. China executes an unknown number of people a day because it's a state secret. In the last 10 years, the numbers have varied enormously, from up to 8,000 in a year, which is about, I think, one an hour. And there's been a lot of scandal attached to that. The Canadians have had a close look at it, and there's the whole issue of executions being related to the availability of body parts on demand for health tourism. So, there's a lot of ugly issues there. But how many people get executed in China now is anyone's guess. Probably maybe 2,000 a year is the sort of number that is now floating around. And America executes not exactly 1 a week, but more than 1 a fortnight. And it's changing too. So it's just one of the many human rights issues that we all have to confront. But it's not linked to Australia in our justice system, but it's linked exactly to the ideas that we're talking about, because one of the things that focusing on the death penalty really brings home is that it shines a light on many other things that are happening around the death penalty, like the abuse of power. So the 3 people in Malaysia who got executed recently got told on a Thursday that they were going to be hung the next day. I don't know what the right words are for that, but kind of distasteful or shocking, confronting, and so on. And the only reason the world found out about it, really, is because one of the families got a letter about 2 days earlier, which they took to, I think it was Amnesty, and so suddenly it was exposed. In Japan, the lack of accountability and the lack of interest in the rights of prisoners, that treating them as something less than equivalent to all of us as humans, and having human rights that matter. You can be on death row for a long time, decades, and at every minute of that time, you don't know whether you're going to be executed that day. You're allowed very few visits. The prison conditions for people on death row, I could spend 10 minutes telling you about them, and you probably just wouldn't believe me. Pardon? Well, you sit in a cell. You're not allowed to move around your cell. You have an extremely limited number of stimulants. You have, I think, a radio set on a station that the guards set for you. You're allowed a very limited number of books. No one speaks to you, you're not allowed to speak to the guards, so you live in silence except for the radio, whatever it is. You have exercise for very short periods, I think a couple of times a week. So the effect of being on death row in Japan is that you will go mad. It's just a question of when. Japan's executed about 20 people in the last 4 years. And, we're great friends with Japan, and so we should be, but we should be bringing these issues up as well. About 2 weeks ago we signed a multi-billion-dollar contract with Singapore. Or I don't know about signing a contract. We entered into an arrangement between two countries for them to be working up in our one of the Queensland army bases, doing a whole lot of training. I think that's a good thing. Singapore is a stable state, and it's got its flaws like every state, but it also has many good characteristics. For instance, racial harmony, religious freedom and things like that really matter in that part of the world. You don't have to go far from Singapore to wish you were living in the conditions that Singaporeans live in. But when it comes to criminal justice, they're miles behind, miles and miles behind. They still have brutal floggings. I'm not talking about a flogging where someone gets hurt. I'm talking about a flogging where the flesh goes flying and where your body is permanently damaged. I'm not suggesting you do it, but you can find it on the internet if you have to crawl down in that kind of mud. But it's disgraceful that it happens. We're talking about a country where most of the leadership is educated, places like here or Harvard or Oxford, presiding over that kind of completely unnecessary cruelty and brutality. So in the context of thinking about all that, we also think about rehabilitation. One of the reasons everyone, when I say everyone, probably everyone in Australia just about did know about Myuran Sukumaran and Andrew Chan, but one of the reasons they gathered so much support was not because of the more important underlying argument about people share human rights precisely because we're human, and those rights should entitle us not to be killed in a premeditated fashion by anyone, including the state. But what attracted attention really was their rehabilitation. And Deborah was talking about, what happens in programs in prisons. Well, in one of the really sad things about killing Sukumaran and Chan was the rehabilitation work they did in the Bali prison was truly phenomenal. And right now people are writing PhDs on it and planning to make films about it. It was quite something. If you imagine the prison being the shape of this room, meant to hold 350 people, holds 1,000 people, and the gangs run the show. In a way that kind of you can think about from the movies rather than any experience that you would have had in your normal life. Gangs are very big in Bali and they're very big in the prison. And with gangs, there's all kinds of things that you would understand: intimidation, power, and so on. Now, in the middle of all that, Sukumaran, who was a big guy and everyone was frightened of him, although he wasn't violent, but people thought he was scary because he was, compared to most of the people, if not all the people around him, he was a big guy. And all the Australians up there, as you would expect from their life of movies and TV, as soon as they hit prison, they hit the weights and train up and get fit. So in the corner of the prison, in an area as big as a few classrooms, they curated, over about 6 or 7 years, they curated a TAFE. They ran art classes, computer classes, English classes, and many other kinds of things like that. And most of you will realise the painting of Myuran Sukumaran ended up becoming the prominent public feature of all that. But there were many other activities going on. And out of that, the prisoners were leaving prison with certificates, some of them provided by university structures, with skills. These are people born into poverty, living in poverty, because overwhelmingly the prisons in Bali, the prisoners are of poor and marginalised people. Just park that idea, because one of Deborah's slides really just said exactly that. The prisons are filled with poor and marginalised people. So killing them was to say, well, this is an amazingly good program that's running in the prison. It's supported by international artists like Ben Quilty, lawyers from everywhere, dancers, singers, teachers, you name it. They're coming into the prison, teaching these kids not just kids, young men and men of all ages really, I suppose, skills. And we know that those prisoners are leaving and setting up art studios outside the prison and gaining jobs. So there was incredible affection from a whole body of the prisoners who moved from being in terrible circumstances to being people who were drug-free, employed with self-respect. And, you know, I know of one example, one prisoner was trying to substitute his life for Andrew Chan's life, saying, you know, this mustn't stop. And even in those last few months of their life, you know, they'd be hitting everybody, every wealthy Westerner to come in, you know, getting money or assistance to help other prisoners. Myron was busy selling his paintings, raised thousands of dollars, and the money goes straight to hospitals to fund operations for prisoners who have no money because there's no health care up there that's free. You know, that's the kind of stuff that was destroyed. And since they were killed, almost everybody who's been related to it has been moved out, the gangs are taking over, and things have gone very badly backwards. So I've got to speak for 3 or 4 more minutes, I think. I've already gone way over. I wanted to really talk about what I'm now about to talk about, which is just a combination of ideas, because, you know, we'll all be gone later today and we go our different ways, but this idea of the rule of law, which I can't now talk about in the presence of a professor on the rule of law, but to me, you know, it's like a bundle of ideas, and, you know, it includes things like there's no corruption, that the judges will be impartial and not influenced by outside influences. And it includes things like you can go to the police station and you'll be safe, which is untrue in many countries in our region. And, you know, Judy's already covered kind of fundamentals about women's rights and feminism. Now, in that, there's no guarantee that it will persist. And so my real point today, which I wanted to develop and I haven't done very well at all, is if we look at the death penalty countries and the things that are associated with that, and we look at the good things in our country, and then we look at the bad things in our country, some of the critical things that separate us from what is much worse, but are constantly at risk, relate to the tensions around the rule of law. You know, if every defence barrister stopped working tomorrow, then in 5 years our country would be unrecognisable. There's always this constant tension going on in the courts, and it disciplines the police to not overreach. And what's scary about our country and other democracies, there's no guarantee that it will continue. And if you look at some of the aspects of what we criticise, I'm not talking about government policy on refugees, but, you know, the idea that the whole border force regime is suddenly, broadly speaking, secret. We don't really know what's going on in our name. The idea that the process of losing citizenship, broadly speaking, has become secret. The phenomenon of Donald Trump can show, I think, is kind of show how badly things can go, how quickly they can go. So I'm going to throw the idea out, then I'll stop. But the rule of law is central to what protects us and what makes us a good country. It must travel with a free press, which I haven't spoken about at all, but the two things that we need to fight for and preserve most of all are rule of law and free press. And if you look at all of the media in the last 2 days, you'll find some examples of the press really being challenged around the whistleblower stuff. And that's where you come in, because when I say you, I don't mean you, but that's where the community comes in, because if we don't fight all the time for the freedom of the press and everything that that means, in terms of ideas and challenging lies and so on, and the rule of law and everything that means, then we have to remember there's no guarantee that our country will prosper and be worth living in the future. And I can pretty much guarantee it won't be. like many countries that we see, you'd run a mile if someone said, why don't you go and live there? And so community engagement, which is what this weekend is all about, and what we've seen in Bendigo in recent times, frankly, community engagement is critical to preserving and building on what exists that's worth protecting and fighting for. And in that context, we should be thinking about freedom of the press all the time and rule of law all the time, because those are the two that in my opinion, together with respect and courtesy, which was about the second third of my speech, which I now will not be delivering. But I'd like to talk about respect and courtesy as well, because with rule of law and freedom of the press and community engagement, central to all of that too is respect and courtesy. Because where they lack or get diminished or get trampled on, what I see is prisoners being badly treated, whether it's in our solitary confinement or when they leave the door of the prison or they get hung or shot somewhere. So the plan of my speech was to throw out these ideas for further discussion. Thank you very much.
In a second, actually it'll be more than a second, I'll throw open for Q&A, but I think that the last point well, everything, but also especially the last point that Julian made is extraordinarily important. I mentioned that rule of law promotion is now big business internationally. Every international organisation does it. There's been a complete change of fashion in all the disciplines which deal with development, human rights, democracy. 30 years ago, no economist talked about law. Now they all say you can't have a developing economy without the rule of law. 30 years ago, people who talked about democracy talked about elections, parties, presidential against parliamentary system. They didn't talk about law. Now they say central is the rule of law. I think they're right, and for many of the reasons Julian said, but nobody knows what to do about it. And the big mistake in a great deal, I think the majority of talking about the rule of law, is to think that it's a sort of box of legal recipes. What do you need for the rule of law? You need institutions which have this aspect, that aspect, that aspect. Legal institutions. It's a bit like if you've got a sore tooth, you think, well, normally I don't bother with dentists, but I've got to go to a dentist. They know about teeth. Plumbers, similarly. So people say, well, rule of law is a matter of the law, and so we go to the lawyers. The lawyers have all these rule of law promotion packages for countries around the world, checklists. Enormous amount is done on that. Some very brave people in some very harsh conditions promote it, and there's almost no success stories we can talk about. And one of the reasons is that we've ignored, in thinking about the rule of law, the last points that Julian was making. The rule of law is an attempt to temper power, and to have a system where power is not arbitrary. That's the goal. And then you should start thinking, well, how can we get that? You can't think that it's just a matter of a bunch of institutions, because what makes them work? So you need a free press. That's an enormously important, maybe more important than your legal provisions. You need what used to be called very fashionably a civil society, which is not just NGOs. It's a society where people have the incentives to, and it makes sense to be civil. You don't worry that the guy around the corner has a Kalashnikov. You feel some security in dealing with officers of state. That's an enormous thing, enormous ambition, but sometimes it's achieved. And where it's achieved, it depends on a community which is not just a blob or a porridge, but actually gets involved and gets engaged. And so we congratulate you for being here. Julian was overly ambitious in saying we have an hour for Q&A. We don't, but we have some time.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm looking at the words on the banner there that talks about talking and doing justice, and really listening to Deborah talking about the fact that people who end up in prison haven't gone through high school or completed high school, and Judy's comments about advocacy. As a member of a school council in a school that has students that come from a suburb which is in the top 2% of disadvantage in the state of Victoria, I'd really like to hear some comments or thoughts on how, as members of the community, we may be able to improve the advocacy and the justice for the children and the families that attend that school.
I mean, I think it's thank you for that question. I mean, that's a really, really important point. And one of the things that I wanted to get across in this report on prisons, and I hope came across earlier, is that it's not about prisons, it's about education. And how far back do you go? I mean, it's intergenerational. So I think it's about advocacy, actually. Let's pick up Judy's point. Advocating for enough money in the education system and the systems in place that support kids who are from disadvantaged backgrounds through the school system, that support them through education, that bring in counselling, for example, to encourage them not to drop out as soon as they can, to give them the best possible chance, to give them the best start in life, so that actually they can become employed, so that they actually don't go down the path that so often happens, that goes from disadvantage into prisons, or disadvantage to crime into prisons, to be more precise.
I think whenever we talk about social justice in terms of remedying disadvantage like that, really what we're talking about usually is money. We're talking about funding for things, just as Deborah was saying. But it seems to me that there's something else going on there. It's not just the funding to go into those programs. It's also funding to go into remedial programs. It's also funding to go into general education programs in the community about what Julian was saying, about respect and courtesy. And it seems to me that a lot of the people who appear before me have not grown up with a sense of respect and courtesy. And if there had been that in the schools, not just for the children but for the parents, if that were to permeate the culture, and I know I'm talking blue sky here, but that's what it seems to me, that respect and courtesy for other people is the very bottom line that answers questions of disadvantage. So I don't think it's a very political question, because the politicians who we elect are loath to spend money where they think it's not popular. And people in disadvantaged places are not popular. So I think it's a whole sort of can of worms in terms of remedial action. I don't think there is a simple answer, just as there's not a simple answer to disadvantage in general.
I think your question is a very good one. It's an overwhelming question. I'm actually on the board of Jesuit Social Services, which Deborah mentioned earlier, and we organised a lot of that research into postcode poverty. And what it really means is there are some areas that, no matter what you look at, education, health, criminal records, and so on, pretty much every criteria that you look at, some communities rank very poorly in all of those, and do so for prolonged periods. The only solution to those kind of multifaceted, deep-seated, long-lasting problems are long-term investments in many of those areas. So the long-term solution requires the kind of political courage and wisdom that we don't see much of, very sadly. In the short term, I think people like us, just ordinary people who don't exercise a lot of power, can't implement all of those reforms. But I think in the short term, there are a few things that everybody can do, like everybody in this room, and every teacher can help organise, is I think as a community, we need to spend a lot more time doing or thinking about and doing things like mentoring and showing examples. So a lot of things that used to happen automatically simply don't happen now. So you're 15 and you get a job as a mail boy in some business 40 years ago, and you might be working for someone like those older people in this room today. I'll put myself in that category, but you know, you're working for someone who was previously in that business for 20, and they train up the 15-year-old boy, so the 15-year-old kid, by the time he's 20, knows about honesty in the workplace, in the bookkeeping, or respect for the staff, or whatever it might be. But that whole structure of society has changed a lot, and I think we need to develop ideas about mentoring. Probably it would hardly be overstating it. The very fact that you're here is probably a self-selecting audience. Probably it would be good if everyone here was literally engaged with and mentoring people from the school that we were just talking about who might suffer disadvantage at almost every imaginable level. And that's, I think that's an idea that really its time has come. I have seen some research about that idea with regard to people coming out of prison in other countries and some programs that are running. And so that includes, like if I was running a school in a very badly disadvantaged area, I'd be writing letters to Judy every second day, or Deborah, or, you know, I don't want to talk about myself, but, you know, people who are public in some way and have seen all kinds of things say, can you come and talk to our students? And have really engaging speakers so the students see another world and see opportunities where they can aim for and aspire for. So role models and good examples and mentoring. I think, you know, the community has to reinvent itself in this area, because it doesn't look like government has the capacity in the foreseeable future to be very impressive, frankly.
Mm.
Could I just add one reference, really? There's a guy at Harvard called Robert Putnam who published a book in the 90s, and he had a team investigating various regions in Italy over 21 years. The book's called Making Democracy Work. And what they were looking, in 1971, various regions in Italy put in the same sorts of municipal institutions on the same model. So after over 21 years, they were investigating which ones did best. And they couldn't put it down to the institutions because they were the same. What they came to believe, it's controversial but it's interesting, is that the communities which did best were ones which had the most seriously developed civic associations, is his term, football groups, choirs, a whole range of things we don't think of in this context, but in which you meet people other than your intimate circle, and you learn to relate to people who come from different backgrounds and so on. And he then, the way Americans often do if they have a certain celebrity, this was an academic book, then he published a book called Bowling Alone. Became very famous because he said in America bowling associations had gone down, a great deal of rootlessness in the community. The only problem was that the Texas bomber turned out to have been in a bowling association. But still, the point seems to me a plausible one, and anyway worth a thought.
Do you think there's an erosion in the education system of critically thinking about power? The second part of my question is to you, Deborah, is about the prison system. I noticed on the graph where the recidivism and everything was going up, how that relates to the prison industry rather than the prison system and the privatisation of prisons. We know everything's political. Whether there's a correlation between when prisons became an industry rather than a part of the system, whether that's creating an increase in stats.
Perhaps, Deborah, if we start with you.
Well, the short answer is no, we didn't make a correlation with private prisons. As the Ombudsman, I am, of course, not a political appointment, I'm not a political figure, and I would make no political observations. I would simply say you can look at that graph and graph it against the government of the day and make your own judgments about law and order policies. I think there is a pretty close correlation there around the reforms around parole, bail and sentencing that have contributed to that. The impact on recidivism, I think, is slightly different, because that shouldn't actually have a direct correlation. And I think that the best conclusion I can draw there is that you put a load more people into prisons and you don't actually increase the access to the programs that are supposedly going to rehabilitate them, including drugs and alcohol treatment programs, and it's not surprising. And you don't, put money into the transfer out of prisons to support them when they get out, then it's not surprising people will go back there. So the factors that have increased recidivism, I think, are many and varied. But we picked the eyes out of as many as we could and put them in the report. And that is about just that lack of a joined-up approach, to think that you can put money into one part of the system and it won't have an impact on the rest, or that you can take money out of one part of the social environment, and that it won't again have a knock-on effect throughout the network. So yes, I think the key message for me is that you've got to look at these things in a much more joined-up way. From the beginnings of society, the education system, all the way through to what happens through the prison system and beyond. As for your first question, I think I'll be very happy to leave that to the social philosophers present and perhaps our facilitator.
I've been listening to you and I've forgotten what the first question was.
Critical thinking. Is there an erosion of critical thinking in our education system?
Yes. I always say that my greatest mentor, who was a woman called Grace Kirkwood, who taught me English in high school, the reason she was my mentor was because she taught me how rather than what to think. And I think kids today, or the ones that I have to do with, are taught much more critical thinking in their homes, or they're not, than they are in their schools. I don't know whether that's a generalisation or it's just the kids that I know, but it does seem to me that kids are learning much more about how to connect with people rather than talk to them. And the social media stuff, I think, is in some ways a negative thing in allowing kids or people to think critically. Certainly, the people who appear before me think in very different ways, and this is not related to class, and it's not related to socioeconomic status, not related to background, but the younger they get, the younger the people who appear before me, the less they think outside the square. That's just a personal observation. So yes, I'd say, I think that is happening, but I'm not an educator, so, I don't know whether it's happening in the schools.
I can't say that we are less that children are less good at critical thinking than they were 10 or 20 years ago. I think Australia is generally not very good at critical thinking of all ages and all age groups.
Yes, I wasn't meaning to say that my generation is fantastic,
I think what possibly gives us the sense that things are going worse in that area is that there are so many more voices that can be heard at once. 30 years ago, if some important issue came up, it would be people like our facilitator, who might be the commentator coming out of a university, or a senior journalist, or whatever it might be, or a Mick Young, self-taught critical thinker, for those of you old enough to remember him. But now there's just so many voices that it's harder to distinguish. I think it's a great problem in Australia that in virtually all areas of society that we let people get away with. There's an absence of good critique, and that's why our political situation is so dire now. It's not like the end of the world, but most of us have a sense that it's pretty unsatisfactory, and that's related to all relevant classes. I'm just going to develop an idea here for 1 minute, which is the question of fear and courage. I was one of the barristers early involved in what we would loosely call terrorism cases, and this developed after 9/11. And what I noticed in the next 5 or 6 years, and I do think this is related to the Prime Minister at the time in a way, and some of the things that were said and done, is that the community seemed to lose courage, and there was a developing fear about saying things and getting torn down if you said things that weren't popular or acceptable to mighty media organisations or powerful politicians. And, you know, I'm not saying Tampa was it, but from Tampa for the next 5 or 7 years, something fell away from our public discourse, and I think it was courage. And ever since I've began to think about this, which is more than 10 years now, I think there's a real absence of people who speak courageously about issues. And the reason is, quite a good one, is that if you speak courageously about issues, you might get attacked in an overwhelmingly unsatisfactory and unjust way. I think it's worth thinking about that. I think in terms of when I'm thinking about mentoring, what I was saying earlier, I think courage is a virtue that we need to identify and positively work on. When we're talking about negative gearing, for instance, what we're really seeing is a complete absence of courage in leadership. When we're talking about some of the taxation reforms that need to occur in the country, there's an absence of courage. When we talk about spending money on prison reform and people leaving prison and making that a high priority instead of a low priority, that's an act of political courage in a campaign and so on. So I think courage and fear are two words that we need to think about a lot. And they used to be thought about a lot. You know, JFK, you know, he wouldn't be shy to talk about courage and fear.
Thank you, Deborah, for the comments on the inquiry into the prison. I thought was excellent. I'm just wondering about your comments about power and the imbalance, because as a person who was the subject of an ombudsman's inquiry and a participant in one of them, I found that the power imbalance was quite the opposite direction and did not feel at all empowered to participate, and in fact thought that and this was prior to your time, I might add, I thought that the whole process was quite the opposite to what I thought and have seen in the Ombudsman's process. And as a result of that, even now, the result of that inquiry has been, well, I thought was a witch hunt, but it was actually has had repercussions still now where people talk about things and acting as a result of using the word the Ombudsman's inquiry. So my concern is, how do you ensure in a inquiry like the Ombudsman's, how do you ensure that the power imbalance when you do the inquiry and the rights of the people being investigated? There's a sort of a funny position there that I sense.
Look, I mean, thanks for that feedback. It's feedback that actually I heard before I came into the job. I mean, just for background, I've been in this role for about 2 years. One of the things, you know, again, for the background of people who are not familiar with my office, the office has evolved over the 40-odd years that it's been in place. And before I came into the role, the previous ombudsman essentially ran the anti-corruption body in the state. So there was quite a different focus in the office around doing corruption-style investigations. And that's something that has changed in my tenure. So, you know, in relation to the way investigations are conducted, it is in fact very different. And I'm very mindful of the sorts of issues that have been raised with me around the way some of the things have been carried out in the past. Happy to have that conversation outside, but I'm, as I say, I'm very aware of the processes, and one of the things that is absolutely vital for me is that I stand for fairness, not only in the decisions that I make around what we investigate, but also how we investigate. And I would be very concerned if that were not reflected in everything that I do and everything that my staff does.
Thank you. This lady.
I'm going to talk about something that becomes the most horrendous crime: medically damaged patients. We're left out in the cold, and with legal representation and advocacy, about 1 to 5% end up in courts, and with the disability insurance scheme, or Section 204 requires medically damaged patients to go for compensation legally first before they qualify for this insurance scheme, or it's not insurance anymore. Health Commissioner fails miserably with medically damaged patients, and health services treat medically damaged patients in the most appalling manner. And we are the silenced screamers who are already patients and become so debilitated that we're stuck in our homes with absolutely no support systems whatsoever. And I now talk at schools in regard to my acquired brain injury from being medically damaged, but I'd like to ask what's going to happen with us poor people, and to extend it a bit further to yourself, Deborah. A high percentage of acquired brain injuries in prisoners are undiagnosed, and what's being done about it, because the brain is 75% water, so low hydration, which would be common even with ordinary people, brings about aggravation and aggression.
It's a very, very serious problem, and it's, thank you for raising it. It's a particularly serious problem in prisons, as you point out, and it's undiagnosed ABI that is also a particular problem. It's something that we've raised in the report. We've made a series of recommendations around it, within corrections. It's a particularly tricky one because and we actually did explore with corrections what more can be done around assessing ABI on coming into prison, so that actually people can actually receive not only the treatment, but actually the recognition that treatment is required. And it is something that as I say, we've recommended, and the recommendations we've made around this have been accepted in principle. Frankly, I'm a little sceptical, but I wait to see. So there are a lot of recommendations around improving the response of the system to acquired brain injury. There is never going to be an easy, quick solution to this one. It will take investment, and it will take time. So, thank you for your question. I absolutely recognise the problem. I think the system recognises the problem, and I will be monitoring as far as the prison's response is concerned, I'll certainly be monitoring the response and the outcomes.
Can I answer that question also for a moment?
Yeah, sure.
There's an election on, and that's why I want to answer. The legal aid funding, I'm not talking about crime now, but it includes crime, but crime, family, if you've got an employment problem, you're going to be thrown out of your housing, you've got a contract problem which is going to escalate, so you suddenly become totally impoverished. All those problems, which I think in many ways are relating to some of the people you're talking about who have a small problem which becomes a large problem because it's not dealt with properly, many of those problems can be dealt with effectively with a small amount of legal intervention. The funding for that small amount of legal intervention has disappeared, broadly speaking, or deteriorated, I should say, not disappeared. Per capita across the country, it's gone like that coming out of the Commonwealth in the last, say, 8 or 10 years. No, 20 years now, from the late 90s to now. The solution is a cheap and easy solution, which is what you should be raising with the candidates in your election now. The Productivity Commission, who are hard-headed economists, who would regard many of the things that I might say about this as not worth listening to because I'm some, dreamer or whatever I might be, but the hard-headed economists have said this is a giant social problem. It increases the cost of housing, health, and many other high-ticket high expenditure items. The solution, according to the Productivity Commission, is we immediately need $200 million into the system, about 120, I think, from Commonwealth and 80 from states, across the nation, would solve a huge number of what seem to be small legal problems, but for the people involved are desperately serious legal problems. Low cost, easy solution, socially vitally important. So go out to the... And in the last budget, nothing changed. So the Law Council of Australia is running a big campaign. There's an election on. Make your candidates commit to the Productivity Commission recommendation for a $200 million injection, which will affect the lives of an enormous number of Australians who have relatively small problems in terms of the national agenda, but giant problems in their own lives. And I think that will address not all, but some of the issues that were touched on in your question.
And medically damaged patients?
Well, insofar as they interact with the legal system, whether it's housing, employment, health, prison, it will help there. It can't solve everything, but it's a practical way of improving things.
Can we move now to this gentleman here? Thanks.
Julian, I was very taken by your reference to respect and courtesy, which I don't always live up to myself, but I think are admirable goals for ways of interacting. But they don't seem to appeal overall in general to the way people want to hear interaction. I'm not a fan of reality television, but I understand that cooking shows, which you would think would be areas where respect and courtesy could easily be demonstrated, actually rate better if conflict is introduced. And particularly, well, I suppose particularly in Bendigo, we've had the debate about the mosques, and respect and courtesy have just gone out the window. And currently, as you said, we're going through an election campaign, and during that time, respect and courtesy just seem to disappear. Our former Prime Minister, who was considered to be the best opposition leader of all time, didn't display respect and courtesy, and it doesn't seem that those are things that are a goal of people in those positions of authority and in what people expect. And I was just wondering if you could expand a little,
sure,
or give your thoughts on that.
Well, I won't be party political, but I think when Kevin Rudd became Prime Minister and when Malcolm Turnbull became Prime Minister, in both those moments there was a sense in the community that we might have something good about to happen, one way or another. Whether you're left or right doesn't matter. And I think critical to that was the perception that they were quite respectful in the way they dealt with people. So I think there is the capacity for the community. The reality really is that if you have good leadership which is respectful and courteous, people will be willing to support it. And you think of some of the great football coaches in the AFL, maybe I shouldn't name any because I might, John Kennedy or something. Some of those guys from the 70s and 80s who were known for being quiet, courteous, but tough men, had enormous respect from the community, and they would have been followed anywhere. We don't share religious values across the community anymore, and we don't share educational history in the way that was once common amongst the educated classes. A very profoundly intelligent friend of mine a few years ago said to me, pretty much the only international currency in ideas, this was actually before Twitter and that kind of thing, I suppose, but is The Simpsons. That across the world, everyone understands The Simpsons because they've seen it everywhere. But it's no longer Shakespeare, it's no longer the Bible, or whatever it might be. There's no sense that everywhere in the world we all understand the same basic ideas, like I'm going to carry my cross, or whatever the images might be. But respect and courtesy cross all cultures, all religious differences and so on. And so I think they're the unifying words that we should insist on and lead with. Insofar as people don't lead with them, I think we can talk about Mr. Abbott in this way. He would not be regarded, he was regarded as, I think in retrospect, as too hard, too aggressive, too tough in the period when he was the most prominent politician. And that reaction against that, whatever his political values or judgments or ideas were, I'm not commenting on that. The style is not looked back from here as something we want more of. And other politicians, Keating got away with it in a way because he was also extremely funny. When you think of some of the things he said, they're outrageous, but he was also funny. So I think we should just insist on it, and, you know, if we don't win that argument, we're going to eventually look like Syria. So we just got to insist on winning the argument.
And winning it in a respectful way.
Yes.
I was going to say, I disagree with what you say about, that it seems that respect and courtesy are no longer have currency. I think they do. And I think the answer to disrespect is respect. The answer to discourtesy is courtesy. I mean, I see people in my court, believe me, and there's no courtesy and there's no respect. And if you treat people with respect and you treat people with courtesy, they have no option. Ultimately, if they keep treating you with disrespect and discourtesy, they end up sounding hollow. An example, this is a micro example, I know what we're talking about is macro, societal things, but I get a lot of very angry people in my court, people engaged in family law disputes. And the way that I deal with that is to acknowledge their anger, to acknowledge that yes, they're angry about that, and if we disagree, sometimes people will argue with me from the body of the court, and I just simply will say, well, I disagree with what you're saying, and we're just going to have to, and I literally use these words, we're just going to have to respectfully agree to disagree about that. And I'm amazed at how that people sort of stop and, you know, what, you're not going to keep fighting? You're not going to keep telling me I'm wrong? That they're surprised by that. And it works. It works. They then become more respectful. They don't change their mind about what they're talking about, but they become different in the way they react or respond or interact with others. And I find that not only in that situation, and I absolutely acknowledge that in that situation the power's all on my side. So if I say something like that, they're much more likely to respond to it. But it happens outside the court too. It happens in personal interactions. I remember one day I accidentally, because I was being totally thoughtless, pulled up beside a tram that was, stopped, and the driver yelled at me and said, swore at me and said, you shouldn't be doing that, in words to that effect. And I just said, you're absolutely right, I'm really sorry, that was a really stupid thing for me to do, and I'll take much more notice in future. And that was like, since I've been a judge. So, and he just went, oh, okay, well, you do that. And that was it. It just seems to me if you respond rather than react yourself, then the person you're speaking to is much more likely to respond rather than react.
And let's go back to Julian's earlier point about courage, actually, because I think that's one I absolutely agree with. Yeah. I don't think that our society is, or if our society is less respectful and less courteous than it should be, then let's have the courage to change that.
Yeah.
I am going to have to respectfully and courteously say it's time for us to shut up. And thank you, and thank our panel.